Is our brain bigger than an elephant's brain?
Well, a lot of people think that an elephant brain is very small, like this idea of peanut, but that's actually completely untrue. An elephant's brain is huge. It can be up to 5 to 6 kilograms, which means that it's actually quite a bit bigger than your brain, which weighs in about 1.5 kilograms.
What do brains look like?
So the brain is shaped a little bit like a boxing glove, where this is the finger of the thumb of the glove, sorry, and this is the rest of the boxing glove up here. The finger of the boxing glove is called the temporal lobe, and that's where we do a lot of kind of listening. And the rest of this, the big glove up here, is really the frontal lobe at the front, the parietal lobe around here, and the occipital lobe at the back, which is where we do a lot of looking. So just to give you an example of that, here's a model of the brain, and as you can see, it does look a little bit like a boxing glove, with that temporal lobe there acting as a thumb.
What is the colour of your brain?
The brain is made up of live tissue, just like your hands or your eyes or the rest of your body. But just like these other parts that each one of them has a color, the color of the brain depends on what it is made of. Most of the brain is fat, and brain is mostly made of fat tissue. So therefore, brain is mostly gray and white and very squidgy and quite wet.
How many brain cells do we have?
So you actually have about 100 billion brain cells inside your head. And there are even more than that number of other cells called glial cells that don't actually do the thinking, but they kind of support, surround, and help the brain cells function. So you have an unbelievably huge amount of brain cells, the same number as stars in the galaxy. And each of those 100 billion neurons can connect to up to 10,000 other neurons and make sort of like a net of connected cells. So between all of that, you have trillions and trillions and trillions of little connections between all of your brain cells.
What do brain cells look like?
So brain cells look almost like a little tree. They have one end that has lots of little tiny branch-looking things called dendrites. And those receive incoming information from other neurons. And then this information goes down to kind of the main body of the neuron called the soma. And then this sends a message down the really long trunk of a brain cell, which is called an axon. So the information goes down the trunk all the way to the very ends where there are little things that look almost like roots called axon terminals, and that's where the neuron sends out a message to other neurons. So they form kind of a big net of these little trees with information coming in at one end, traveling down through the axon, and then coming out the other end and going on to other cells.
What happens to our brain when we die?
Okay, imagine how is your brain working. So basically your heart will like push all the blood into your brain and bring some nutrition and oxygen. So if you die and your heart will just stop pumping, then your brain will get nothing from your heart. So your brain will be also stop working as well. So it will just like other part of your body, so be decomposed and just into dirt. Yes.
Can your brain grow?
Your brain can grow. So when you're born as a baby, your brain is quite small and it does grow a bit, but not as much as the rest of your body grows. But what's important is not how big it grows, but how all the parts of it connect. So what's really important is how the different parts of the brain connect to each other and how those connections grow and become stronger. So you have lots and lots of connections, and then you strengthen them, so you lose some of them, but some of them become really good connections, like a motorway between two places rather than like a windy road. So that's how brains grow, and the important way how brains grow is through the connections.
Can your brain get smaller?
I think the answer to that is yes. So what we can show is that as you get older, and we're really talking about sort of very old people in their sort of 60s and older, they tend to show that the size of their brain shrinks as they reach that older age. There's also some evidence to suggest perhaps that our brain can get slightly smaller when it gets better at doing things. So it's becoming slightly more efficient at doing a particular job. It might get slightly smaller.
What happens to your brain when you're angry or happy? What happens when you're sad?
Well, even though those are three quite different emotions, the brain actually doesn't distinguish that much between them. It sort of depends what bit of the brain you're looking at. In the olden days, the way you would answer that question is to sort of identify one region of the brain that maybe was active in an MRI scanner during happiness or sadness, and then you would kind of try to differentiate it between other emotions. But nowadays, people are a little bit more interested in how that area connects to other areas. So when you're looking at happiness, there are some things it has in common with sadness. You know, things are more significant to you if you're happy when you learn about it, same when you're sad when you learn about it. And some people are a little bit better at learning about the world when they're happy, and other people are a little bit better about learning about an environment when they're sad. And that kind of might predict development of different psychiatric disorders. So it's a little bit more complicated than one area being involved in one and one area being involved in the other. Having said that, the area of the brain in general could be thought of as like the center of the brain. So the brain has a cortex, which is the outside, and a subcortex, which is like the inside. And all of these emotions that you're talking about in general have a lot to do with the inside of the brain. And then the interactions between this inside of the brain, the subcortex, and the outside could determine like whether you're angry about a social situation versus something you read verbally versus something you've seen. So how you're experiencing that will determine how you feel it, basically.
What would happen if you didn't have a brain?
If we didn't have a brain, pretty much not much would happen at all, because everything that's more or less everything that you can do, from breathing and walking through to thinking and singing, is being controlled by your brain. So brains are really important in terms of how you see the world and being able to act on the world.
Is it true that your brain controls you?
It is true. It's also true that you control your brain. Everything that you do, everything about the way you are, it's all coming through your brain. When you feel happy, when you feel sad, when you decide to stand up and jump about, or when you decide that you're sleepy and it's time to go to bed. It's the brain which sets all of the decisions and all of the activity that you do all day long and all night long too.
Can your brain move?
No. Your brain only moves when you move, because your brain is more or less fixed inside your head, swimming in a bath of a special kind of fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And the brain just sits there in its bath, sending messages down to your muscles so that you can move, and receiving messages back from your body which tell you things like, I'm tired, I'm hungry, something is hurting where I've just trodden on a nail in the playground. But the brain just sits there receiving all of this information and sending signals back out to the muscles to say what to do, and the brain is only going to move if one of those signals that it sends goes to the muscles of your legs to make you start running away.
What part of your brain thinks the most?
The part of your brain that thinks the most depends on what you're thinking about. So there are some parts of the brain that are specialised for doing particular things, like the back of the brain is particularly important for seeing. Probably I'd answer that question by saying the part of your brain that's always thinking all the time is the front of your brain, the bit called the frontal cortex. And because that's the bit that's always planning, evaluating, thinking, the bit that gets us out of bed in the morning, that helps us go to school, or say we don't want to go to school, the bit that makes all the plans and thoughts for the future. So I think that's the bit that's most always thinking.
Can your brain glow?
Our brains don't glow, but you might have seen a picture like this, where it looks like some bit of the brain is actually glowing. But that's not what's happening in this picture. What's happened here is researchers have taken a picture of the brain while it's doing something, while it's doing an activity, and then they've done some tests to see which bit of the brain was the most active while that person was in the scanner. And then they coloured in the bit where the brain was the most active, and that's what looks like glowing.
Is your brain bigger than your stomach?
Your brain is actually about the same size as an empty stomach, but your stomach can stretch a lot, so that when you eat a lot of food, your stomach actually stretches and gets bigger. And your brain can't do that. Your brain is always the same size because it's inside of your skull, and your skull doesn't stretch at all. So yes, your brain's about the same size as your stomach when you don't have any food in it, but as soon as you put some food in it, then your stomach is slightly bigger than your brain.
What happens with your brain while you're sleeping? What does your brain do when you dream?
It's fair to say that we still don't know a lot about what happens when we're asleep, which is interesting because in fact we're asleep for about a third of our lives. So that's a lot of time to not know much about. But one of the things that seems to happen when we're dreaming and when you're having quite vivid dreams, an argument is that your brain is teaching your parts of your brain about the things that have happened to you that day and kind of filtering it and organising it. So sometimes things that you recognise and things that have happened to you turn up in your dreams, and the argument is that that's actually because of what the dream is reflecting, your brain sort of storing information about what's happened to you during the day.
When I sleep, does my brain grow?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. So there are some studies that have been done where people have looked at what happens when people try to learn new words. So what the researchers have done is created made-up words, and they've made those made-up words by basing them on real words. So a good example of that is the word cathedral, which is another word for church, and the researchers changed that into a made-up word called cathedric. And what they show is that after people have slept, they can show evidence that that particular word, cathedric, has kind of gone into their mental dictionary of different words. So, and they don't show that after the same amount of time that hasn't involved sleep.
What does my brain do while I eat?
Well, before you eat, the brain does certain things that it wouldn't do if you weren't hungry. So areas of the brain are involved with desire for food, and then slightly different areas are involved with when you're actually eating food, and then still different areas are involved with satiation. So those are three processes that happen when you're eating. Satiation means fullness, by the way. So we'll work our way backwards. When you feel that, when you feel full, there are signals from your brain that communicate with the rest of your body, indicating that you shouldn't eat anymore, that you've reached kind of the level of energy consumption. As we all know, it's not that simple, and sometimes you eat past your fullness, or sometimes you think you're full and then you're hungry about half an hour later. So it's not a direct route of communication, but in theory there's specific brain cells that indicate when you're hungry and when you're full in one part of the brain called hypothalamus. While you're eating, then there's a whole other factor, which is what you're eating. So certain areas of the brain are really interested in whether you enjoy what you're eating or you don't enjoy what you're eating. And that's kind of what determines the pleasure that you get out of that situation. So if you really like chocolate, there's an area of your brain that anticipates you getting chocolate and then responds to actually you receiving that chocolate. If you really hate broccoli, there's a whole system in place in your brain that will become less active when you get broccoli, or maybe a disgust involved region that will become more active. So there's kind of this interaction between, are you hungry, are you full, and do you like what you're eating, do you not like what you're eating, kind of the subjective part that might depend from person to person. As a final thought, there, even on the tiny level in your tongue, there are kind of different receptors, different pathways that are involved with sour versus sweet, versus maybe you've heard of this other taste called umami, which means like savory. And all of those are slightly different. So the way we process those different flavors have a slightly different pathway to the brain, basically.
What part of your brain remembers all your memories?
There are many parts of the brain that contribute to our ability to remember. It depends on what kind of memories that you're talking about. For example, if you try to ride a bicycle, or if you try to remember what you had for breakfast this morning. Many parts of the brain interact to try and help you create new memories along those lines, or indeed retrieve them. There are many parts of the brain that contribute, but some parts are thought to be more important than others. For example, there's one part in the middle of the brain called the hippocampus, which is short for seahorse, which is thought to be really important for your ability to remember what you had for breakfast.
If you have a brain crash, can you think again?
So there are lots of reasons why people can have brain injuries. So people can have brain injuries, for example, if they've been hit by a car, or if they've had they're hit by an object. And also people can have brain injuries as a result of changes to the blood flow to the brain. So if blood is stopped coming into the brain for any period of time. And depending on where the injury is, it will have different effects on what they do, on their behaviour. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that people can recover from these injuries. And what's quite interesting is a suggestion that the other side of their brain might be able to help them in some way to recover damage. So if there was damage in the left side, for example, you might find that the right hemisphere, the right side of the brain, takes over and helps to support whatever it was that part of the brain was doing before they had the accident.
When you sneeze, do you kill brain cells?
This is a common thing that people are worried about, but the answer is no. You do not kill brain cells when you sneeze. When you sneeze, you do increase the pressure in your head, but you only do this a very little bit and for a very short amount of time, so it's not enough to actually kill any of the brain cells. So don't worry.